everybody. It's 9:30, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming out this morning. I know it's a really, we were just saying we're at the white knuckle stage of the end of the semester. Just we're trying to hold on tight because there's so much going on. But we're really thrilled to welcome Chris Moore and Julie Pelton from the University of Nebraska at Omaha to share with us their model, their course learning evaluation model called Impact. So they're going to do an initial presentation to explain their work to you, and then we'll have plenty of time for any questions that you have or any discussion that we may want to have. We're going to keep this door open for now. This door is unlocked. This one is not unlocked, so people can come and go. And then if it gets a little noisy, we'll pull that one too. Go ahead.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Is everyone excited to be here? All right, because student evaluations of teaching is a topic that gets everybody excited, completely non-controversial. Though I think we could also come in and talk about changing the gen ed if we wanted to really.
We did that last time.
Okay. And it went absolutely
We're
smooth,
doing
and there
that
were
now.
no problems whatsoever, I assume. All right. So I'm Chris Moore. I have a bunch of different hats that I wear at the University of Nebraska Omaha. I'm the Haddix Community Chair of Physical Science. What that means is I just work with our pre-service and in-service teacher populations in physics, chemistry, and the geosciences. I'm the director of our STEM Teaching Research and Inquiry-Based Learning Center, chair of the physics department, and then professor of physics. And this is?
Julie Pelton, chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at UNO. All the other hats I wear are off campus. I've been a long time sort of leader within the ASA, the American Sociological Association, and teaching and learning, and past chair of this section. And so that's how I got on this wonderful grant with Chris.
Yeah. So the big idea here is on our campus, and then more broadly, how do we measure impact? We want to measure the impact that our faculty are having on their students, right? And so the basic framework that we took was thinking about this in terms of, first off, we want to do this in a scholarly way. We want to base everything that we're doing on the scholarship of teaching and learning across a diversity of fields, right? So we can talk about as wide a population of courses as possible. The other thing is we wanted it to be actionable. Meaning if we're going to be evaluating teaching and we're going to say to our professors, hey, here is some feedback, we want that feedback to be actionable. The professor can do something about it, and they can do something directly to influence how they're being evaluated. The third is equitable, right? And we have eliminate there, we're never going to do that, but we could at least try to reduce the implicit bias through observations of what faculty do. Right, as opposed to their affect on others, like our students. And then finally, reliable. Do we get consistent results? Right, we want consistency so that our instructors know that what they do, like any changes that they make, are going to make a difference. And so that sort of forms the foundation of our impact model and the instruments that we've developed and the research that we've done over the years. The whole idea being here is we're trying to reduce the implicit bias within our student evaluations of teaching. We're almost there. We're not there yet. Right? Uh-oh. There it is. And we're back. All right. So I'm going to just tell you a little quick story about how this started on UNO's campus. We hope maybe similar little kickoff here can happen on UTC's campus. In 2019, we invited Carl Weinman to our campus to kick off our STEM Trail Center. That's the Teaching, Research, and Inquiry-Based Center that I'm talking about. Carl Weinman is a Nobel laureate in physics. And he got his Nobel Prize by making the coldest thing ever in the universe, well, at least here on the planet, called a Bose-Einstein condensate at the University of Colorado Boulder. And then he decided that he was going to solve a harder problem, and that harder problem was science teaching. Right? And so right now he is a professor at Stanford with a dual appointment both in the Department of Physics but as well as the College of Education. And he focuses completely on science education. And he wrote the book, Improving How Universities Teach Science. And so we invited him as the STEM Trail Center. We're science, technology, engineering, mathematics focused center. And we invited him to come speak about, how people learn and how they make decisions, right? And then more importantly, how we can assess that and how we can evaluate that. And one of his criteria for him to come to our campus was that we had to, this was my homework, he told me that I had to do this, deploy his teaching practices inventory to a large number of faculty on our campus. So I worked with our director of general education, and we sent this out to all of our gen ed science and social science courses. And it was great, and it kicked off a conversation. And then something happened in 2020. Do y'all remember what that was? This is the interactive part, right?
Yeah,
Y'all remember
right.
what that was?
Yes.
What was it? There it is. Something called a
Tiny
pandemic. Right? And so we were using the teaching practices inventory, and then all of a sudden, all of our courses went online. And then in 2020, in the fall, about 75% of our courses were online. And even today, a much larger number of our courses are online than they were before the pandemic, even though we're fully back on campus. And what we found out very quickly is that the teaching practices inventory was completely invalid for online courses. Right? Did not work. There's also the small problem that was completely validated for science and social science courses. And so we went and we realized that instrument was something that we had to change. And so that was the birth of the inventory of methods and practices associated with competent teaching that I'll talk about here in a minute, the impact. But before we get to that, let's talk a little story. We're going to tell two stories today.
Yeah.
We have instructor A and instructor B, and then Julie's going to talk about instructor
X and Y.
X and Y. here in a
They
minute.
look weirdly familiar, but that's because I couldn't find better pictures. Chris took the good ones.
That's right. So these are not actual photos of instructor A and B. We're not using their names, but what I want to point out is these are actual instructors. These are actual instructors in departments on our campus. And so this does tell us a little bit of anecdote that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about. The first one, these are two STEM instructors, so they're in a STEM department. I'm not going to tell you which one. All right. One is female, foreign born, mid to late career, lower than department average student evaluations. The other is male, born and raised in the region, so right around Omaha area. Early career, and then higher than department averages in student evaluations. Those are our two instructors. So the question becomes, are those student evaluations that we're giving us an accurate picture of what's happening in these two instructors' classrooms? Is it telling us information about the impact that these instructors are having? Is it giving us good information about what they're doing? Is it giving us good information about how the types of practices that they're deploying and expertise that they have in teaching? So before we get into that, I want to just talk a little bit about a framework that we're working on, right? This is kind of setting out what we mean by what we're trying to measure here. There's a couple of ways that we can measure. We can measure a whole host of things, right? And we have to be careful about defining what it is that we're measuring. And so we've broken it down. This is actually part of a faculty senate group at UNO. That's composed of myself as the chair of the physics department. We have the chair of the economics department. We have the chair of the philosophy department. We have people from the College of Ed. We have people from across about 4 or 5 different colleges right now. I think it's either 4 or 5. I know we're missing one college out of the 6. All right. And we are looking at this in terms of teaching inputs and teaching outputs. Right? Very simple way of thinking about this. And what are teaching inputs? Well, we have classroom practices. These are the things that instructors do in the classroom. We have course preparation. These are the ways that instructors prepare their course. And then we have self-reflection and innovation. These are the things that go on in the mind of our instructors and the types of activities that they're doing, whether they're innovating within the classroom or they're trying new things, that kind of growth mindset idea that's all rolled up into that. The other side is teaching outputs. Teaching outputs would include things like student learning, student knowledge. And you notice that those are slightly different, right? What students know is different from their learning through the course. And then student engagement. So in one case we have what instructors do, and on the other side we have what students gain. And it's important to point out that the teaching inputs are things that instructors can directly control. I directly control what I do in my classroom. I directly control how I prepare for my course. I directly control what goes on in my brain in terms of reflection, innovation, growth mindset. On the teaching output side, these are the results of student actions in preparation. All right? So they're influenced by what we do as instructors, but they are not controlled by what we do as instructors. Right? I think some of us know that we can get different student evaluations depending on the time of day that the class is taught. Right? Right before lunch, bad idea. Right? And then there's also a whole host of implicit biases that can go into affect-based instruments that student evaluations of teaching often are. So we decided we're going to look at teaching inputs. And because it fits our framework, we're going to look at teaching inputs because it's what the instructor can control. It's actionable. We can talk about what are best practices. We can go through the research about best practices across large numbers of disciplines. Now, that is not at all to say that teaching outputs aren't important. In fact, they're critically important. Student learning, student knowledge, that's why they're here, right? We know that they're linked, we just have to be careful with how we're doing the measurement, right? So student learning, student knowledge, student engagement, these are all critical components, and they're all to be measured. They should all be measured, right? However, it's very difficult to measure student learning in sociology and in physics with the same instrument. I shouldn't say it's difficult, it's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. And in fact, it's impossible for me to measure student learning in an introductory physics class first semester versus second semester, right? Those are completely different instruments. And so you can see that that becomes a lot harder. Now, what we have found is on the input side, there's a large number of practices that are consistent across large numbers of disciplines. There are things that Julie's doing in her classes that is similar to the things that I'm doing in my classes, and there's research backing up those things that we're doing across all kinds of other disciplines. And so that's the creation of the inventory of methods and practices associated with competent teaching, which we call impact. It focuses on what instructors do. That's it. Right? So we're looking at the practices and methods that are being deployed in the classroom. So I've got a couple of different examples here. The first one here is you're seeing a graph of impact score in a specific area. So this would be an info and materials as an example, right? And then this shows you like what you would check. And if you want to check, I'll show you the QR code here in a moment. You'll actually be able to go through this with one of your courses. You can do it in about 5 to 8 minutes. Right? And it'll automatically score for you, give you a bar chart like this, but a broader one with more criteria. And we're not quite sure on this one yet, we're still working on it, but should be able to predict your instructional style. All right? And so here's a couple examples, solutions to homework assignments. Check all of the supporting materials that were provided to the student during the course. Solutions to homework assignments, practice exams, or previous year's exams, lecture notes. Right? Are these things just being provided to students? Now, what we always like to highlight is that not all courses do all of these things, nor is it appropriate for all courses to do all of these things. Right? And that's not the intention. It is, in fact, I don't think I have ever seen what would be called a perfect score, because that just isn't, that's not the mindset that we should be in. Right, in terms of thinking about this. It is literally what we call an inventory of the methods and practices that instructors are doing in their classes. So here's another example. This would be check all that typically occur before and after class, our online equivalent. And I bring this one up just because I'm going to show you the other side here, right? There's a little box right here on every single one of our items, other. This tells you a little bit about how we've gone through and validated and refined the instrument. So every one of these sections, there's an other, so that an instructor feels like, well, you know, I'm doing something that's pretty impactful. I'm doing something that is research-based. They can put in other, they can fill in the little text box down below, and then what we do is we go back and we evaluate all the qualitative data that we get, all of that text. And one of a few things happens, right? Either we go, hey, That's just one of these criteria that we already have in checkboxes. We need to make our language a little bit more clear if we see a lot of this, right? And that's happened. That's one of the ways that we've refined the instrument. The other is, hey, that's something that we haven't seen before. And if we can go find in the literature where we have evidence that it's very, very impactful, right, then it can be added to the inventory, right? Because every single item on this inventory is individually validated. And so that does mean that you can pull things off and you can put things on without the entire instrument falling to pieces, its validity going away. So what can we do with it? Well, we can identify areas for improvement on the individual level, right? This is based on what instructors do in their courses. Right here, I've got different categories and the impact score based on those different categories. The blue represents one instructor. The, what is that, orange? Partially colorblind. Orange represents another instructor, and then the little gray bar there, that represents the university average for UNO, or at least the average for the data that we're talking about for this semester. Right? Remember that story we talked about, instructor A and instructor B? You know what the punchline is? Instructor A is the blue line. All right? And that gets at the heart of the story we're trying to tell. Now, these are real people, right? Instructor A, instructor B, same department. Or you can imagine as a chair, looking at student evaluations of teaching, thinking about merit, thinking about promotion, thinking about all the different personnel decisions that we make based off of student evaluations of teaching. Is it telling us what we want to know? Right? Is it telling us what's going on in the classroom? Right? And here's an example where we see an instructor that is deploying a large number of high-impact practices within their classroom, but their student evaluations of teaching are lower. Why? We don't actually know, but it could be because of a host of things. It could be because she's a woman in STEM. It could be because she has a foreign accent. It could be for a whole host of other things other than her expertise. And what we also know is that because these are usually linked, what's going on in the classroom and student learning is greater in her classrooms. And we have data for that too, which I can't show you because it starts to show you who people are, right? But we have data that shows that student learning is greater in that classroom as well. And this does tell us something. It tells us first off that students are not qualified to talk about the quality of instruction in a classroom. They are qualified to talk about how that instruction affects them. They are qualified for that. But we have to be very careful with how we, how we interpret what it is that the feedback that we're getting. But this does give us, tells us information about individuals. And more importantly, it's like a scaffold. It's like a rubric, right? So what can instructor B here do? They can look at the criteria and how they compare with the university average. Hey, look, they're doing pretty well in assignments and exams as an example, but man, info and materials. Well, how could I change that? I'm instructor B. I want to know how can I change that? Well, I just go back through here and I say, here's some information right here. Oh yeah, maybe I should give them the solutions to the homework assignments after they're done. I haven't been doing that, right? Maybe I'm a young professor. I don't have a big set of solutions. I'll work on that. Practice exams. Well, it's the first time I taught the course, but next time I'm going to put some practice exams. You can see how it can be actionable for that instructor in order to come back the next time, and they're going to do better, right? So it's actionable for the instructor. It gives us information as department chairs. Now notice I changed the axes here a little bit for you. A little game that we play that I teach all of my students. Hello graph, what can you tell me? It usually goes on in my head, but I like to say it out loud every now and then. Hello graph, what can you tell me? On this axis, what changed is I've got department A and department B. We've changed the blue and orange bars. So watch out for that, right? And so this is showing an impact score between two different departments. And it's not, we're not seeing a huge difference between the departments across the board, but what you can see is differences in departments in the individual areas. So it gives us information to chairs that maybe Department A, doing pretty good on info materials. Their instructors are providing a lot of good resources before class. Instructor B, Department B, hey, maybe we need to work on that, right? I can now target as a chair professional development. I know what kinds of conversations we need to have in our departments. And then for administrators, we can look at similar things, right? Well, where as an institution, what areas as an institution do we want to improve in, and where should we improve in maybe? So for example, we look over at innovation in teaching. Now, not every professor should be innovating in teaching because we're not all necessarily, that's not really what we do, right? It's not our area of expertise. I am a physics education research person, right? So I sure better be innovating in education. That's literally my research area, right? But it's not every physicist's area, right? But maybe it's a goal of the institution to be more innovative in their teaching. And we have metrics now that can be looked at to see how instructors are, what they're doing in their classrooms. What departments are being very innovative. Maybe then that gives us like a signal to go say, hey, let's go look at what that department's doing. So it identifies these areas for improvement. So now some data. So we gave it, now first off I want to point out that this is the faculty impact. We have two versions of the impact survey. One is for faculty. That's one I was just showing you. The other one is called the S impact, or the student inventory of methods and practices associated with competent teaching. We're going to start with the faculty version because that's the one that we have very well developed and very well validated. The S impact is the one that we are looking at replacing our student evaluations of teaching on our campus with. It's in pilot stages, and we have some measures of reliability and validation that we'll talk about, but not a lot, right? And that's ultimately where we need more pilots and we need more courses to run it through before we can start answering some of the questions that we have and that I'm sure you're going to have as well. But if we look at the F impact, I'll show you three graphs here. The first one shows, all three of these are showing the F impact score, right? But the functions are slightly different. So we're looking at the density of F impact score. These are all histograms, basically, density histograms for F impact between two areas, STEM and social science, between two departments, and then one department in particular. So the first one is, we look at this first graph here, A. We have STEM and we have social science. Julie likes this graph. Why do you like this graph? Julie likes this graph. There's even more data that that she likes a lot as we get here a little bit later because the social sciences are awesome, right? I like to point out that it is a little bit wider distribution, but and she likes to point out that just means that we're all very, the sciences are, all are terrible. Yeah. All right. So that's kind of, because you can see how we can, what it's doing is differentiating. Here's two departments. And what's interesting about this is we know information about these two departments before we did this. All right? Department 1 is a very traditional department that has recently hired a couple of people in the education realm, research, discipline-based education research area. You see that little bump way up high here, right? That's not quite bimodal distribution, right? Because you have one big giant peak and then a little tiny peak, right? We're seeing in the data those couple of people that they just recently added into that department. The other department, Department 2, is probably the most innovative department on our campus. In terms of their teaching, they have the strongest assessment, right? And we see that in the data, right? So if we had to pick two departments that we knew information about beforehand, these would be the two. And that's what we did when we looked back and we saw exactly what we were expecting to see. This gives us an idea of the validity. It speaks to the validity of the instrument, that it is that what's coming out of the data are things that we should be able to predict based off of information that we knew before. And then the third department is one of my favorites. This department is absolutely bimodal. And this is, again, we have information about it anecdotally from the expertise of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning folks that are on our campus. In that department, you are either all in on innovative teaching or you are all not in on innovative teaching, right? And so we see a split, a bimodal distribution amongst those two departments. And I bring that up because this speaks to the validity of the instrument, right? Is it predicting what we expected it to predict? Starting with things that we already knew. Gender, demographics. This is also something that we expected. Women in STEM use more high-impact practices than men in STEM. This is known, this is national, this is across the board. We see this data. In general, women in STEM use more high-impact practices in their classrooms than men. That is what we see on UNO's campus. There's no distinction, right, between that and what we expect from the national data. So once again, we see a trend where the instrument is predicting what we would have expected, right? And so in the blue, we have men. In the red, we have women. And again, this is not just STEM. This is STEM, social sciences. Right now, I think this data set includes just our STEM disciplines and our social science disciplines, and only our gen ed courses. That's what we've been for this particular data here, just gen ed, STEM, and social science courses. We do have some things to say about the other disciplines, all right, but less data, unfortunately. The other thing we realized very quickly as we were doing this research is that, oh boy, are we underrepresented of BIPOC faculty on our campus. If we look at our regional statistics, and then we look at actual numbers, participants within our research study and what's going on, we are very much underrepresented. And so what we were trying to do is look at some demographic data and separate that out. The unfortunate thing is that the numbers are so small that we really can't do that very well. So if we look at, as an example, over here in this graph, we're looking at the density distribution of F-impact scores for BIPOC faculty in the blue versus white faculty in the red, right? Well, we see maybe some difference, but what I want to point out, you see that little hump? That little hump at the very end there, right here. This one. All black women. Now, it's like a couple of them, right? So really that's, the numbers are so small that we want to be very careful about what we are able to say there, but that again speaks to the trends that we see nationally. So what can a 5 to 8 minute faculty survey tell us? And again, this is still, we're talking about the faculty inventory. It takes between 5 and 8 minutes to complete this for a course, all right? I think Jennifer, you said you did it. Did it take about 5 to 8 minutes? Yeah. It took about 5 to 8 minutes. Now it could take longer. One thing we found is that those in the social sciences take longer.
Checking so many boxes. It takes a while.
They also write comments.
I can guess some of my colleagues who had lots of additional information for you, I'm sure.
Yeah, so they write a lot of comments in the qualitative parts, right? But it should take about 5 to 8 minutes. So what can it tell us? So here we have F-impact score as a function of what's called COPUS instructional style. So COPUS stands for Classroom Observation Protocol for Undergraduate Science. All right, and then we're only looking at F-impact scores in this particular data for science courses. Again, because the COPUS is validated for science courses. All right, what is COPUS? So what we do is we send a trained expert into a classroom twice to observe that classroom. And what they are doing is they are looking at the practices at 2-minute intervals. They are marking down what the instructor is doing and what the students are doing. And that gives us a large picture of the different things that are happening within that class. What percentage of time is being used with just passive lecture? What percentage time is being used with active questioning? What percentage time is being used with a whole host of things? And then from that, a chemistry ed professor, Marilyn Staines, who was at University of Nebraska Lincoln, she's now at UVA, she had a large research grant that was able to take all of that data, that percentage-based data of time use, and create a model for instructional style that predicts about 88, 89% of the time. Right? So about 88 and 89% of the time, this gives us information about instructional style. So we have 3. 1, 2, 3. 1 is didactic. style. That means that the classroom is primarily lecture-based. It is exactly what we're doing right now, right? You notice I pause every now and then and I ask a question and I try to get some feedback, but this is a didactic style right now. Nothing wrong with it, right? We're just, and it has its appropriate places, right? But a primarily didactic style for the whole class. 2 is an interactive lecture, right? So more of an interactive lecture style. So it'd still be a class like this, you can imagine. You're sitting in your seats, I'm up here and jabbering on about something, but then I'll put up a multiple choice question. And you can either use clickers, if you have clickers. I actually don't use clickers. I use little pieces of paper that's like A, B, C, D, E, F, and they have different colors and you can fold them, right? Because the batteries never run out of those things. Right? And when students forget to bring them, they can make one with a piece of paper, or it's easy for me to hand them one, right? And I always get to go up to students, and I can see them holding them, right? The clickers, you don't know whether they clicked. If they hold it up, and you can walk up to a student and say, did the batteries run out on your card, on your little piece of paper card today, right? But anyway, that's an interactive lecture style. And then the third one would be not what we, but what Maryland's groups termed student-centered. There it is. All right, so that's going to be highly group interactive, peer groups together, right? Cooperative group problem solving and like math and mathematically based things, discussion groups within the social sciences, right? Anything that gets students together in teams and groups working primarily, right? And that can be done in any type of infrastructure. It can be done in this type of infrastructure right here. It's harder, much harder. That's another area where I could go on for a while about creating the structures. These are the things I can talk to your administration about. Creating the structures that lead to great teaching, right? So, if y'all have a large amount of money to invest in classrooms, I'm sure you do, right? Just piles of cash, right? That's what us faculty just assume, right? Okay, so that gets us an idea of what we talk about Copas instructional style. 1, 2, 3. Does our little 5 to 8 minute faculty survey give us information about instructional style? Well, what we did is we sent somebody to observe 9 of our courses twice, right? We got data back for 7 of them, right? A few people didn't actually fill out the 5 to 8 minute survey after they promised to. And so what we can see is a correlation between Copas instructional style and F-impact score. And so that means we think that we are going to be able to reasonably predict Copas instructional style with a 5 to 8 minute instructor survey. That's a big difference than paying a trained expert to walk into a classroom twice. This took all semester. This part right here took all semester, right? It took an entire semester. It took probably about 40 total hours or so of one person's time. And if we can match that with a 5 to 8 minute survey, that would be fantastic. Right? And it gives us great information. Go ahead, Julie, talk about how awesome that social science data looks.
Oh, look at that. It's so pretty.
All right, so this is a breakdown of our various disciplines, right? So we have the total for UNO over the 2021 calendar year. So this is spring, fall 2021. Broken down for social sciences, broken down for science, and broken down for math. We took the F impact and then we used that to predict instructional style, right, for all of our faculty. This is a little bit preliminary. So, these are going to have pretty decent sized error bars. We hope that as we gather more data, one of the things that we're working on is building into the next proposal much more of this, much more observation, so that we can make that correlation between what it is that we're measuring and what it is that experts are actually in the classroom observing. Right? But right now we can see social sciences roughly evenly, almost no didactic, there's like no lecture. Very few social science courses are they walking in and speaking to you like I'm speaking to you right now. Right? It's mostly a blend of interactive lecture and student-centered, and I would bet that's probably going to be based off of the logistics primarily. What size classroom, 100, you're going to probably be an interactive lecture.
Yep.
A smaller classroom, it's going to probably be more student-centered. Sound right?
Yeah, sounds right. Yep.
And then science. So science, our gen ed science, by the way, or gen ed sciences typically they're in classrooms like this. right? So we see a lot more, and we were actually, I'm very happy about this in a lot of ways. I'm very surprised by the size there. So a lot of interactive lecture that's happening, very little didactic, and not a whole lot of student-centered, at least within our gen ed science courses. And then math is just split. Just a balance between highly interactive and highly didactic, and very little interactive lecture. All right, and so that gives us some interesting information. And we, again, being careful about how we interpret it. We're not saying that everything needs to be all the way on the completely group-based interactivity, right? There are logistical concerns about each of these, but it does tell us about what's going on in our departments, in our areas across our campus. And then finally, not finally, we're going to talk a little bit about instructors here in a second, but that S impact, that student evaluation that they can fill out. So what did we do? Well, we took the F impact and we changed the wording. The F impact says things like, did you do this in your class? The student version says things like, did you observe this happening in your class? Right? And we tried to keep the items, there's a word. We tried to keep the items as consistent across instruments as possible so that they would correlate well. But then we also had to be careful with making sure that how we word things for an instructor and how we word things for a student, that could be different, right? Because students might not know the words that we're using for some things, when we talk about different types of practices. So we deployed this to about 550 students across campus, and this was in a pilot. We went on a road show as a faculty senate committee to a large number of different departments. We recruited volunteers that wanted to give this a shot within their classroom. We sent it out. We also sent out our normal student evaluation of teaching, the one that we've been using for about a decade now. And then we gathered up some data. So 2 things that are important. The first one is, I don't know if you have this problem, but response rates are garbage. Anybody? So I'm assuming y'all are all online? Yes. So not at UNO, but I'm sure they did the same transition before. I was at another institute. I've been at a couple institutions. We went from paper to online, and that transition resulted in the largest decrease in response rates that you could have ever imagined happening possible.
Yep.
And the same thing happened at UNO?
Yeah, I was here during that transition. That dropped precipitously. Yeah. And as we've had conversations, some of them are far more negative than they've ever been. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes, and when your response rates drop, that also means that the validity, the reliability of your instrument becomes not so good, because you end up getting very motivated people. And who is very motivated? The angry ones. Either the angry ones or the very happy ones. And so seeing bimodal course evaluations is quite common. All right? And so what we want to see, if we have a reliable instrument, is very narrow distributions. Obviously, we're going to see a little bit of difference, variation, but they should be fairly narrow distributions. And so we sent this out to 500 and something students across something like 100 and something courses. I might have that wrong. Yeah, those numbers don't seem right. I think that's about right.
Yeah,
that's about right. About 100 and something courses. We only had about 4 courses that we got enough data that we could actually do a good density distribution, right? Because we were looking at response rates that were in the teens in some cases. Again, they were getting 2 evaluations of the class. Right? We're moving to new technology as an institution, by the way, for student evaluations. The technology provider, the person that's selling it to us, tells us that we will get much better response rates because we're building it into Canvas and a whole host of other things. But this is also the people that are selling us this, so we do not know the answer to that yet. I will have more information about that over the coming, in the next they've already
year?
deployed it.
I believe,
In the fall. So it was deployed in the fall, started in the fall, and then this spring. So we'll know in the summer what those response rates are really shaking out. But our question is, can students be reliable observers of classroom practices? Well, here's 2 courses with large response rates. And what we see is we see distributions. We see somewhat normal distributions, right? There's some tails, right, on the low end. That's actually not unexpected, right? And they're relatively narrow distributions. Now, we got to be careful, like what does this tell us? Now, we're working on prototyping what data would end up going to instructors and what data would end up going to chairs and administrators, right? Because there is, it is on our campus and it could be on your campus, a tendency to say that there is a difference between 3.2 and 3.1 on a student evaluation of teaching. And we know that that is not any meaningful difference whatsoever. In fact, they're 2.8 versus 3.2. There may be no meaningful difference between that. And I know as a chair myself, I look at them and it's like out of 5 and I see a bunch of 4s, but then I see like a 3 and I don't even realize that some are 4.2 and some are 3.9. It's like, well, these are lower, right? Just because it dropped down below. It's like the 99 cents, right, that trains our brain. We have to be careful with that. And so some of the prototypes we're working with have no numbers. They actually just show on a range, right, with a 2 sigma, bar basically showing, the range that a faculty member would be across what would be the UNO normal distribution. And we're just breaking it into low, medium, high implementation of practices, so that you can get a little bit better picture without using information inappropriately as it goes up the chain, all right? And then finally, what are we doing? Well, we still got a lot of work. This is what's happening right now on the impact instruments, right? So one thing that we are continuing to work on was this correlation between observations, expert observations, and the F impact. We need to fill in these little spots here, right? We should see lots of little data points start filling in here, lots of little data points start filling in there, lots of little data points start filling in up the top. And that will give us an idea about how well it predicts instructional style, right? Is it like predicting within like 80, 90%, or is it like 40, 50%, right? And we don't have enough data to actually say that yet. The other thing we're looking at is how does the F impact correlate with the S impact? Are students telling us the same thing that faculty are telling us, right? And there's 2 important lessons from this. Students lie, faculty lie. So we'll see if they're lying together or not, right? But the F impact correlation with the S impact. Now, in reality, right, faculty, we can do things that the students don't necessarily observe, right? And by the way, we removed all of the items on the student version. I forgot to tell you that the student couldn't observe, right? They can't observe an instructor doing preparation pieces, right? They can't observe an instructor doing, chatting, discussions with their peers, right? They won't see that in the classroom. So we moved some of that. But are the faculty, what faculty doing, is it reflected in what students are seeing? And that could be because the instrument is poor, because we're not clear in the language that a student can understand it, or it might be because the faculty member themselves are just not conveying what is happening in their class. We know from a bunch of research that just being explicit about what you're doing in a classroom is very effective. Just saying, hey, you know what we're doing right now? We're doing this, right? And then we have, we need more data on student observations. So the density, the sort of density histograms are across a whole lot more courses. And so we're collecting more pilots, we're collecting more partners. UTC could be one of those partners so that we can run more pilots in actual classrooms to see if that student version is giving us a reliable number. If we start seeing bimodal distributions, right, with this instrument, that's bad. That's not a good instrument, right? So that speaks to the reliability. And then S impact with COPUS, right? Continuing that, so the student version with COPUS instead of the faculty version with COPUS. Just checking my time. All right, so now I'm going to segue into some things that Julie's going to talk about, because I'm up here talking, data stuff and instruments and all of that, right? But Julie's going to talk about what's going on in instructors' minds, right? And how, their perceptions of all of this, right? And what's getting in the way of great teaching. So this kind of speaks to sort of this bubble here on what instructors do, that self-reflection, innovation, growth area, and what might or might not be hindering them.
Yeah. So, like Chris started us off with is the understanding that while all of this data about the F impact and S impact is really, really important, we also do want to be using it to create change on our campus. And so one of the other parts of the project is actually qualitative interviews with faculty who completed the F impact and were part of this study so that we can find out more about what concerns or barriers, and I'll talk about those concepts and how they're in the literature described, what's stopping them from implementing high impact practices, because without that information, I don't think administrators or department chairs or even faculty know exactly where to touch and how to touch and what kind of campus supports and resources to build to help folks get beyond those concerns and those barriers. So, like I said, same pictures, different faculty, instructor X, instructor Y. This time we've got a female full-time instructor who has been teaching on our campus for quite a long time, and it uses those high impact practices a lot, scored in the top quartile of our F impact. And then we've got instructor Y, a male tenured associate professor. Same thing, also been on campus roughly 20 years. Tends to be more of a didactic or an interactive lecturer in terms of the anecdotal evidence I have about this person. So a lower level implementer, someone who scored in the lower quartile. Excuse me. And these two folks are kind of characteristic of the sample of folks we interviewed. Obviously, we've only interviewed 13 folks, so not completely representative, but it became very clear that we've got sort of a bimodal thing going on in terms of our instructors on campus, and there's very strong things we can see about what's stopping them from adopting high impact practices. So you all are, some of you are faculty, right? Hazard a guess at the first thing that people talk about as a concern or a barrier to doing high impact practices in the classroom? Time, yep. Anything else? I mean, that's number one, so to give away the punchline first. Other responsibilities, yeah.
I guess there needs to be an incentive looking at it.
Yeah, good, okay. So in our work, we're using a model where we're talking to folks about concerns, and we put concerns at the individual level. It's something that an individual faculty member has control over. It's something within their purview. And we talk about barriers, which tend to be more at the institutional level, so things that are not quite as controllable by the faculty member, but could be sort of supported and concerns addressed, barriers addressed through institutional supports. I will also say that because all of this research was taking place during COVID, we've actually got a third concept that we're trying to see if it gains any traction, and that's that there's really some obstacles out there that are beyond the individual, the institutional control altogether. So I'll come back at the end. I didn't put it on this slide. I was trying to keep things as simple as possible, but I'll talk about what the obstacles look like for folks. I also think it's helpful to focus on individual and institutional areas that we can work on, because those are more under our control than pandemics, for example. So without a doubt, everyone talked about time. Some folks talked about time management. Some folks talked about competing interests. There was definitely a sense of a lack of time overall, which is disincentivizing to sort of do what you need to do to find a high impact practice, to design an activity, to then implement it in your classroom, and ultimately to assess whether it was an effective teaching strategy, right? Some of the folks were very specific about how taking that time to do all of that work to implement high impact practices was specifically not possible because teaching wasn't their primary or only responsibility. That's my second icon in there. And then the other group of folks on our campus talked a lot about how adopting high impact practices and taking all that work to focus on your teaching was actually taking away from your research, which was equally hard to find time to do at an institution like ours where there's heavy teaching research and service expectations. So those are the three kind of contours about how time affected folks. They also focused a lot on practices, so teaching practices. By far the thing that was mentioned the most fortunately, unfortunately, I don't know why I felt inclined to say that, but was assessments. So grading, exams, traditional and innovative assessments, trying to evaluate student learning. Some folks, middle icon, were really, really, really focused in on describing to us how they could assess and evaluate student learning in group exercises or service learning, and how they could see student learning happening when they're implementing very high impact practices. And then the third icon, this other group of folks, when they're talking about teaching practices, are mostly just talking about their lecturing and whether or not their exams were an adequate reflection of student learning and could measure student learning. The third thing that was very, very prominent is this idea of resources, primarily a lack of resources. This ranges from books, classroom space, material, environmental resources, to social, emotional resources, the people on our campus, from needing IT folks to wanting some social support, some professional development, sort of a mentoring kind of a relationship as a resource. The one group of folks was literally having to talk about very specific things, like not having computers, not ever having an office on campus. These folks primarily were also talking about wanting a classroom with movable chairs so they could implement their innovative teaching. The other group of folks tended to be talking about rewards and whether or not the system values and rewards high impact practices. RPT was certainly part of it. Teaching awards, not so much. For some part of the people who talked about awards, it was monetary, it was compensation, but primarily it was that student evaluations and our merit and our P&T process doesn't give you credit for doing those kinds of things. So this is how we can see the qualitative sort of feedback about what are the major barriers if I look down the category. Oh, and before I leave this, I've mentioned I would come back to COVID. The obstacles part of this research, our faculty told us a lot of things, but one of the two things that came through a lot was that the 2 years of COVID, when they're reflecting on their teaching, it really was about how COVID had impacted what they are able to do through the switch to online teaching, but really about how it affected their students and about how that impacted their ability to improve student learning. And there's a lot of conversation that I don't know would have taken place were it not for having these interviews at this point in time. It was a lot about equity and access and inclusion at campuses, and a lot of sort of high-level discussion about education. A lot of our students come from underserved backgrounds. They don't have the same kind of adequate preparation that other students might have. And that external thing we can't control really started to become a reality for some of our instructors. So if I flip how we're reading these icons, the punchline for this story is that it is our part-time or full-time instructors who are really in this middle line. They're torn, they want to do high impact practices. They are doing more high impact practices in terms of what they're telling us, but they don't have the resources, literally. They've never had a computer given to them by our university. And the fact that they are contractually hired and cannot predict whether they are going to have a job in 2 years really, really impacts. And so it's really interesting, right? They're actually the most, out of our sample anyway, the most high impact practice sort of implementers, but yet they feel really constrained. I think they would be doing even more. And the full-time tenured faculty tend to be focused more on research, traditional lecturing, and whether or not there's an institutional level reward for what they're doing. So I would actually guess that some of the reason why your science folks have so much interactive learning is because our gen ed courses are taught by some really, really fabulous part-time instructors who are in this. They are in it to the end. They will do whatever they can to help address equity and teach students and get great student learning outcomes. So where we are emerging here is that there's a really important thing that has to be addressed on campuses, and there's a power differential And I think we're landing on whether you have a PhD or you don't have a PhD, and how that impacts your job security, your negotiations for contracts. And that exacerbates the impact of using traditional student evaluations of teaching, because those folks who are most vulnerable on our campus are the most vulnerable to negative student evaluations. To bring it full circle, right? We've got anecdotally at least one person who told us that a class was taken away from them because their evaluations fell below a certain standard for their department, which is really sad because this person loved teaching that class and presumably did it really well and just had an off semester, but all kinds of negative impacts came just because students possibly didn't like this person, possibly didn't like the high impact practices they were engaging in, because that's something else that the literature tells us. Students who aren't used to being in classrooms where you're doing a lot of group work, service learning, experiential, applied, if they don't like it, they really push back on it, and they really push back on it on traditional student evaluations of teaching. I think that's it.
No, we got one more.
One more?
We got a few more.
Oh, you're gonna do this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's there.
Okay.
So we want to change things, right? So one thing we wanted to do was first, you might guess, I should go away from this slide before we get too far. See what you guess. We hypothesized that high implementers, high use of high impact practice people would be over here talking with each other. And that people that are low users of high impact practices would be over here and talking with each other, right? And that all we needed to do to institute change on our campus was to get this group to talk to that group.
Nope.
Shaking your head. That story isn't going to come true, huh? No, that is absolutely not the case whatsoever, right? And so that was what we were hoping. And the hope was there because that's easy. It's so easy just to get these two groups talking with each other, especially if you can identify them with something like the F impact. And so we were expecting that would be a great way to lead change. By God, it is not. And here's why. What you're looking at here is what's called a social networking analysis sociograph. Right? What we do is we talk to, this one was done based off of a survey style. There's a couple of ways that you can do social networking analysis. This was survey style. And so we would generate a list of names, we'd see who they interacted with on teaching, and then we would build those interactions. So each one of these dots represents a person, and then each one of these lines represents an interaction, a teaching interaction, we're calling it. Okay, so that means that this dot right here, you follow this over here, that person right there, they had a teaching interaction going on. And then we broke those people into quartiles, quartile 1, 2, 3, and 4, as quartiles typically are broken into, right? And that's based off of their use of high impact practices, based off of our F impact instrument. And this one might have been teaching practices. Over here is teaching practices, inventory data. This one is actually off of F impact data, this sociogram. Right? And so quartile 4 would be the high use, those are the higher scores, and quartile 1 would be the lower scores on the F impact. So do faculty discussions about teaching correlate with greater use of high impact practices? And there's a great big giant no. Right? One thing to look at in this picture is that it is a nice, big, tangled web. We actually were not expecting this. Our faculty are talking with each other about teaching. And the low implementers are talking with the high implementers about teaching, right? And so this graph over here is a measure, first off, it's teaching practices inventory score. Again, that was what we built the F impact off of, so very similar, but then COVID happened. Right? So the teaching practices inventory score as a function of collegiality. Collegiality is a network metric that we pull from this data that basically shows a person's position within the social network, right? Do they have a large number of interactions with a large number of different people, right? They would be your attractors within one of these graphs. They'd be one of the people that's talking to everybody, right? No correlation whatsoever between collegiality and teaching practices, high impact teaching practices, right? So that means that you have a lot of network actors out there that are very strong within those networks, that are talking with everybody, but they're fairly traditional instructors, just like you have very high level implementers that are out there talking to everyone and speaking and having a great time and participating in this social network. So the actual change model has to be, this gives us information about the change model that we need to look at and think about how we can implement change on our campus. Now the problem with this is these little lines represent teaching interactions. Did I define that? No, I have not defined that yet. All we've done is just said, did you have an interaction with this person about teaching? Right? And so it's sort of self-defined by the person that's saying it. So we realized very quickly that we don't know about the quality of the interactions. And so we did a different type of social network analysis where we sat down. It's an interview style where the actual interviewee generates their own list of names of people that they've interacted with, right? And then they rank them on types of interaction. And then we also follow up finding out information about what they can, about the levels, different types of interactions and the levels of interaction, and whether they make a distinction and how they're making a distinction about the levels of interaction, right? Did they work together on a teaching grant? Did they, talk about, something happening that day in their class, or was it more like, what PowerPoints we might pull from, or what YouTube video would make a nice YouTube video, or so anything like that. And when we did that, we go through and we find some information, some interesting information about the teaching interactions that are happening on our campus. We call this, first off, the first thing we had to do is we had to define teaching expertise different than the literature defines teaching expertise. There is a long list of literature out there that looks at expertise in teaching and tries to see various differences within within the various expertise levels. The problem is all of that literature looked at expertise in terms of things like number of years teaching, right? And other things that are not directly correlated. We find no correlation between number of years teaching and implementation of high impact practices, right? So we've sort of redefined how we talk about expert versus inexpert teaching, right? And then we're looking here at high level. HLI means high level implementers, and then LLI means low level implementers, right? And we have 3 categories. There's actually 4 categories. I left out one of the categories because it wasn't that interesting. The first thing, though, I want to point out is what's in bold. If we look across both high level implementers and low level implementers, their motives for having discussions with their peers about teaching are the same, and they're good. Everybody is motivated by student success. The very first thing we have to realize is that everyone is motivated by student success. You know that professor in your department you hate? They're motivated by student success, even if it doesn't seem like it, right? And so that's a good thing. That's great, right? And now we're going to go through some of the other differences, right? So for network alters, what does that mean? It means who are you more likely to, the alters is the person that you're having the interaction with. You're the interviewee, and then you have the alter is the person that they're interacting with. That's what alter means. So HLI, high-level implementers, all identified alters from their unit. Low-level implementers, all identified alters from their unit. So units are talking together. Unit means usually is a department. So all the physics faculty are talking to other physics faculty. That's not shocking. Right? Sociology faculty are talking to other sociology faculty. And the high-level implementers all identified alters in a different unit, every single one. And a different unit would be like, me talking to Julie, as an example. And the low-level implementers, none in the interview group identified alters in a different academic unit, right? Which also means that none identified alters in a different college, whereas high-level implementers, all of them identified alters in a different college, right? And then none identified, for lower level, identified alters in a different institution, whereas the opposite is shown for high-level implementers. So the breadth of the teaching network is larger for high-level implementers, is what we're finding. All right, then again for motivations, the motivations were pretty similar Right? Again, motivated by student success. But our high-level implementers were able to provide specific best practices reasonings. They were able to specifically say why they were using, the practices that they were using and the discussions that they were having. Whereas our low-level implementers focused around general aspects. So specifics being like, oh, we talked about, this model for instruction and how we could implement that in this context, right? Whereas the low-level implementers would say things like, we talked about, general pacing of slides or whatever, right? Much more general practices. And then there's the conditions surrounding our discussions. Both groups were on some sort of instructional focused teams. We have communities of practice that we have on our campus where Center for Faculty Excellence can provide teams with some resources, very small amounts of resources, but to meet together and talk about various things, including teaching. We see that on both sides, but more high-level implementers are working with instructional teams. Most of our high-level implementers have frequent discussions, whereas our low-level implementers all had infrequent discussions. And so what I mean by that is our high-level folks are really interacting daily. And so they may be teaching slightly different courses, or they may be teaching the same course or whatever, but they're talking constantly throughout the semester, whereas our lower use faculty that we interviewed are not. They're talking maybe once a semester, or at the end or the beginning. And then a few other things, seeking informal interactions regularly versus irregularly. And then speaking of some of the things that Julie was talking about, these exigent obstacles, COVID-19 being a massive one, right? A huge thing that got in the way of us doing some of our best teaching. Because how many of us, by the way, in this room knew how to teach an online course before
Wrong audience. Chris.
How representative are you to this institution?
There are plenty of people who were not.
Wow, that went horribly wrong. Anyway, not a single one of our high-level implementers identified lack of interaction because of COVID-19, where almost all of our low-level implementers identified interaction because of COVID-19 that they had less interactions because of that. Right? We found that pretty amazing. The high-level implementers we're overcoming the fact that we're sitting at home to be able to have those sorts of conversations. Right? And so this is kind of some bullet points that have come out of that work, where we're trying to figure out how do we implement change, and we're looking at the network of our faculty and how we can utilize that network better. So the first thing is that these teaching networks are a necessary condition. So all the literature says that a strong teaching network is a necessary condition for diffusion of anything. You need a network to diffuse into, right? The problem is, what's bolded, that's not a sufficient condition. We actually have a strong social network on our campus. You might have a strong social network here. You might not, I don't know. You have to measure it, find out, right? But they're not a sufficient condition. You need more than that. We don't see any correlation between social network positioning or levels of use of high-impact practices. There's no preference for interactions within groups, though wide variations between the quality of the interactions. So remember when I showed you that first qualitative piece, that big graph, and I said, oh, look at that. There's no, low-level implementers are talking, quartile 1 is talking with quartile 4 all day long. We are not having any problem with that until we find out what they're talking about. So wide difference between the types of discussions that they're having, right? Which seems a little contradictory, right? But I think we get more information about the high-level implementers and working with other high-level implementers because they are so specific in their discussions. Whereas oftentimes they don't even make the list. The person they're interacting with in quartile 1 isn't even making the alter list of the person in quartile 4. But the reverse isn't the case, right? Teaching interactions among faculty are not enough on their own, right? So we can't just take teaching, we can't just form groups In fact, this gives us information about our community practices model that we have on our campus. Just forming groups to talk about teaching isn't enough on its own to diffuse high impact practices from high users to low users. Even when that interaction is strong, even when it's supported by an institution, you can pour piles of money into it and you still don't necessarily see diffusion happen. It's because diffusion is very, very, very hard. Engaging individuals, we think, is going to require both structural positions and pedagogical knowledge. What do I mean by that? It means that we need to find people that have structural positions in the network. That's those strong actors. Who's everybody talking to? And that has pedagogical knowledge. Both of those two pieces together. Who's everybody talking to? And in particular, are they strong proponent of high impact practices? Using those people within our networks to strategically engage with some institutional support in different groups across campus. And so that's kind of the big idea here, that institutions as a whole need to engage in individuals that have both expertise defined smartly, we think, right? That insert into the existing or build new teaching discussion networks. So you need teaching networks if you don't have them already, and you need to build them around that expertise, and then facilitate frequent discussions focused on cross-cutting practices, right? And so this is the model that we're beginning to implement. We have a pilot project that's funded for chemistry and physics over the next 3 years. We had a larger project that we were hoping was going to be funded for a lot more departments over a lot longer period of time. And we just got the sad, sad news that the National Science Foundation hates us, at least briefly. We're going to fix that. We got some good feedback, right? But the departmental action teams model is what we're basing these things off, basing some of our change off of. And you can see the pieces in there that reflect some of the findings that we found in both our qualitative and quantitative research, right, on trying to make this diffusion happen. Right, this is not our model. The departmental action teams model is actually developed at the University of Colorado Boulder and has been shown to be effective across a lot of things. We're just applying it to instructional change. And so at the center, you have departmental action teams. You form a team. That team needs to be broadly representative. Tenure track faculty, full-time faculty, part-time faculty, and students. Students' voices are important because it tells us things about how some of this creates affect and change, how it affects them. Right? Around them are trained facilitators. So we insert into those teams trained facilitators, right, that have some of that expertise. Conferences where they meet with other departmental action teams and finding out what they've been working on, the successes they've had. Models of success. Trained facilitators are different from our models of success. Trained facilitators are there to facilitate the team and keeping them moving and guide it in a productive direction. Our models of success are those strong actors that we were talking about earlier that have both pedagogy and network positioning as well as expertise. And then resources, which is always a hard one, right? But stipends, because we have to incentivize, provide the rewards for this type of work, and course grants to provide the types of resources that we find that some faculty are lacking, right? And then all of that can go into the classes that these teams are working on. And then there's a feedback mechanism of data where we're looking at the F impact, the S impact, so both the faculty version, the student version, and then something that we're developing called the obstacle. Because,
we need another instrument.
we need another instrument, and we're pretty good at acronyms. We pride ourselves in acronyms. The obstacle is, oh God, can I remember it?
There's no way.
Because we had to really torture it a little bit to get it in there, right? But it's an instrument based off of faculty concerns and barriers, faculty perceived concerns and barriers to implementing high impact teaching, all right? And so that's at the basic beginning stage, framework stages. We have no instrument yet. It's at the framework stages that we're building that based off of the qualitative work that Julie's been leading. All right, so we're looking at making some institutional change through individual change, because that's the only way it happens. Because I can tell you there's a great deal of literature in institutional change, and what never, ever, ever works is top-down change. Never is effective, especially at an institution with a large number of what are basically very loud, very vocal, and a lot of freedom types of employees that we call faculty, right? And so it has to be a process that's more from the ground up. Now, we also have to be careful because individually it's very difficult to diffuse, right? And so individual to the larger institution is hard. This is what with the group that developed it calls the middle approach, right? It's a focus on units and making change within units and gathering teams of individuals to make that change at the unit level. And that's it. The big idea here is you can't change what you don't measure. You cannot change what you don't measure. So if you want teaching that has research-based best practices, and those that are across a whole host of different types of disciplines, then you have to measure the actual practices that are happening within the classrooms. Right? You can't change what you don't measure. And so you can find more information. That little QR code is there. So if you're watching me on a video, right, you can scan that little QR code. You can also go to stemtrail.unomaha.edu where we have some more information. It also has a link to the faculty inventory of methods and practices associated with competent teaching. You can log in, you can click on it, it takes you to a Qualtrics survey. You can actually complete it for one of your courses and get it instantly scored. It'll give you those bar charts that I told you about. So comparing you with UNO, obviously not UCT because we don't have any data for you, right? And then it will predict your instructional style based off of the score. And that's a little bit, a little sketchier in terms of its research backing right now, right? But we don't gather any information about who you are, your name, any of that stuff. It's just right now a tool that you can use to see what it looks like, right? And then there's one other ask that we'll have. And I don't know why it just dropped down all of a sudden, but we do need some help. So we have a large NSF grant. It's coming to an end very soon. That means Julie and I will be writing a very annoying report that will be very long. We have an external evaluation team that is evaluating our work and is looking at the impact that our work is the impact that our impact work is having, right? And so that QR code will take you to a quick Qualtrics survey. All it does is just ask for like your name and email and your institution. And what that will do is we'll compile it with our external evaluation team, and they may reach out to you and have you, ask you some questions. They'll either do a survey or they might do an interview with you about our work and what you've seen of our work, and depending on how deep you end up in that pool, you could end up like reading some papers or something. It all based off of what you're willing to provide. That team is going to be very flexible with that. And what that does is it provides feedback. Again, of external evaluation team, they don't even tell us who you are, right? Provides us feedback about our project that we can use to make our next project even better.
Yep.
All right. And that's it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions that we can answer? And thank you, those of you that are at home watching this on video. We've had a good time.
What's the relationship that your university faculty have with anyone trained in instructional design on your campus?
I think the right answer is that it will vary. I mean, some people use those resources and have strong connections, social ties to the folks who do instructional design, repeatedly go back for course reviews and apply for the grants to put a class online, go OER, all of that kind of stuff. And then there's other folks who don't even realize that that exists or that professional development opportunities exist at all. And then somewhere in the middle is probably where most of us lie in terms of, no, it's there. This is the person during COVID who knew all of the IT people, right, but didn't necessarily know the instructional design folks. So Some support access in the middle, and then heavy users and other folks who just, no matter how many times an announcement about a professional development opportunity is in your email, they'll just never see it for some reason.
And then the follow-up for that, for some of those groups, like how often do the people in those groups go, hey, we have people on campus who could be a resource for us. Why don't we invite them into this group?
I don't know if I can answer that one. Do you have a sense of?
It doesn't happen often, and here's why, I think. So I got to preface that with I think, because I'm not making a scientific statement, I am making a Chris Moore making stuff up on the fly statement. There is a lot, and because it's partially true, there's a lot of feeling within different units that, you know, what can an English professor teach me about teaching? Physics, right? And some of that's true. Right now, what we're doing with all the practices that we have on our inventory are cross-cutting, right? You know, they're broad literature practices, so they look more general as you read through it. Me as a physicist that has very specific pedagogical content knowledge in that area would be like, well, there's a whole host of things that are missing here, right? But that's because there is no way to do that for an English class or for a sociology class, right? So there is some truth to that, but I think a lot of faculty kind of take that broadly. I'm like, well, what's an English professor going to teach me, right, about my class? So I can see that as being some of the case. I mean, I know anecdotally that's some of the case because I've literally heard those words before. And then the other one that we see, again, the biggest barrier we find when we interview faculty is time. So we can have in the emails all the different professional and development activities that we can provide. We can spend piles and piles of institutional money on professional development activities, and we still end up with the barrier of time because it takes time to go and do those professional development activities. And if the instructor doesn't feel value in them because maybe the mismatch between disciplines or whatever it might be, then they're even less likely to invest the time that they need to use those resources. It's one of the reasons why we're really focusing on departmental teams, again, because first off, we form a team, we incentivize the formation of that team. All of those people are combined in the same unit, so they can get specific about specific pedagogical issues in their discipline, but we still bring in the trained facilitator, we still bring in not necessarily someone in their unit, but somebody with that general pedagogical expertise, right? But they're working around that. And if we can, the time issue is always going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you get the preaching to the choir effect, right? Where the people that show up are the ones that need to show up.
Yep. And I think that's good because the folks who are really embedded in the teaching network on campus are the folks who know about all of the places to go. So the more you're bringing that person into a department group to connect folks who may not know, I think has lots of room for efficiency. The other thing about our campus is our Center for Faculty Excellence director is really, really responsive to feedback. And so to the time issue, a lot of feedback was that part-time instructors, other folks who really just have limited time, are really interested in recorded and short opportunities for thinking about very specific practices. So I know they're doing a little bit more of that, but that's separate from instructional design. The thing that our instructional designers are doing more, because we've invested in sort of people and other resources, is they're doing a lot of the building of things or modeling how to build things for our instructors, which is actually something that came out of our interviews a lot. That part-time instructor who has to work in the library or right before class really wanted someone to just be able to like help them build this thing and help their creative juice get into sort of a technological form. And so the more I think that we can get our instructors to understand that that resource actually exists on campus, should help them out. It really will reach one of their needs in terms of this mentor person that really helps them with the tech stuff.
Two questions. On your F impact, when I took the inventories, it seemed like for perhaps a couple of the arts, it might not work well, you know, or like, you might not be able to use it for like clinical nursing that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So are you building something that works for those, that is more show and do, or one-on-one pedagogy? And so how far have you spread it, I guess, across the campus? And then come back to the other question.
Yeah, that's an easy question. No, it's not validated for that. It's really hard to, right? And so this gets into the challenge of creating a instrument for everything. So for example, we have a large number of individual instructional music classes on campus, right? It's very, so the types of things that we're measuring on that are not going to be particularly useful for that individual music instruction. And our faculty, music faculty, will be very quick to tell us that, and they're right. So it's not really well designed for that. There's other areas too where we have, it's not validated. Laboratory courses, and in particular, we have some classes that are called course-based undergraduate research experiences. And so these are like, say, a biology lab where they're actually solving biology problems, right, that we don't know the answer to. They're actually doing real, authentic research in the classroom. That's like an insanely high impact practice, right? Just the structure of that course altogether. But our instrument does not do a good job of identifying that, right? And so it's not validated for those types of courses. So you can imagine an instructor that's teaching that type of course, if they do poorly here, that's a valid concern of theirs, right? And so that's one of the reasons, and this is just a result of the fact that the more general you get, right, the less information you're going to be able to provide. And so what we've done is kind of gone, we want it to be cross-disciplinary as much as we can, but focused on classroom-based practices. And what we mean by that is classroom-based, where there's multiple students within a classroom, because that's the predominant mode of instruction on our campus. And then realize that this is not useful for small number groups. And our current student evaluations of teaching are just garbage for that too, right? Because it's n equals 1 on a survey like that, right? So we're going to have that problem with any type of survey instrument, period. They're just not going to be valid or reliable for real small groups like that are taught, like nursing, music, art, right?
Yeah.
So.
I will just say anecdotally, as a social science person, the first time I took the impact, I was like, none of this makes any sense to me. I don't know what a teaching set or a practice set is. So we've gotten it so that the instrument is a lot more accessible to the social sciences. I imagine it will continue to possibly change as more humanities folks are brought in and tested out with us. But
we're explicitly working with the philosophy department right now because they were the absolute most vocal about how much they hated it. And so we said, great. Come tell us why. Right? We want to know exactly why. We want to know what is measuring that you don't think it should, or what, so we're having those conversations. And so that's the next step in how we can continue that validation. Now, of course, they got to bring to us, if they're doing something that they think needs to be in there, well, okay, what's the research backing for it? Right? Can you show us the literature that shows that this is effective practice? Right? Because that is the foundation. It's got to be scholarly. And for the most part, they do. Right? Oftentimes, it's just wording too. Like, oh no, that's what this means. And they're like, well, that doesn't mean that to me, right? I'm like, oh, well, let's see if we can make it a broader, more inclusive wording. And
yeah.
That's a challenge. It can be challenging, and that's what I mean by each of the items is validated individually. We're looking at the wording of each item to see how it encompasses what an instructor is doing, and then at this, and their perception of what they're reading. And again, we don't expect all faculty to do all things. Never would. Not even close.
The other question that I had, you mentioned it at the beginning about online. And so high impact practices, some of them translate to both. But when you get the F impact and the comparison to the UNO, it's all UNO. are you creating metrics for the synchronous and asynchronous and kind of the high flex and some of these other types of classes where in some of those, the asynchronous, you're relying a lot on the student, you have a lot less interaction with the student to kind of push towards those activities?
So as you go through the inventory, you'll actually see some of the wording. You can tell some of the wording changes that we had to do from the original, like massive wording changes from the original teaching practices inventory. Because when we sit down and we look at, what's considered great, good teaching in the online space, because there are differences. We looked at the Oscar rubric that's in the SUNY system, and a host of other things, and I'm blanking on the framework, the theoretical framework on online instructional teaching. There's a lot of overlap, right, between why and what you're doing in an asynchronous online course versus why and what you're doing in a classroom space, right? Student interactivity is an example. If you do, say, think, pair, share, or peer instruction with the clickers or with the little card in the classroom, how do you simulate that in the online space, right? You can have the embedded questions within the lecture space, right? You can have discussion boards. You can have a whole host of these sorts of similar things that you're trying to get at that are all linked to the same fundamental idea of how people learn, right? And so that's what we try to capture. And so that's where we were looking at the modifications such that it worked within online courses. Now again, are there going to be some edge cases for online courses? Obviously, of course. And then how well does it do online courses? Well, we think right now fairly well, pretty well. In fact, I have this data to show, but when we're looking at the validity between the original instrument and the old instrument, right? So we distributed this to 90-something faculty, the original teaching practices inventory. If we do just a word cloud for all of the qualitative data that comes out of that instrument, so people can fill in, other, or they can fill in general comments. We got a large, online pops out of that cloud, right? I have emails from probably at least 8 to 10% of that would-be population saying that, well, I didn't even do it because this doesn't mean anything for my class, right? Very clear that instructors were not interpreting it, not looking at the in-class practice and translating it to the online class, right? And so when we went through a couple of rounds of development of the F impact, by the end of all of that, we get almost no comments of that nature.
Online synchronous?
Online synchronous and asynchronous.
Yep.
And asynchronous.
Yep.
In fact, most of our courses that are online asynchronous.
Yep.
That is by far the most popular online modality of any of our courses on campus. And so that's led to a big shift into the online asynchronous. Because for all the reasons that you would expect, accessibility and all of that. Students appreciate it. But it's harder. It's a lot easier to translate your in-class class to synchronous, which is what everybody did, a lot of people did during COVID, especially during that first semester where we all went online. But online asynchronous is our largest population of online people that are in the surveys. Did we answer the two?
Thank you.
Okay.
You all mentioned a qualitative component to the process, but you haven't spoken much about that qualitative component and how it operates and how it's used. Would you speak to that just a little bit?
Yeah, so the question is to speak a little bit more to the qualitative component. I just realized we weren't repeating the questions for folks online, sorry. I have to give compliments to the graduate students who are part of this team. I'm not a qualitatively trained researcher. In 2020, I think we started interviewing folks, and in total we've got 13 completed interviews. They were from a stratified random sample of folks who completed the F impact over the previous years, with the hope of trying to get to interview equal numbers of folks from each of the quartiles. We didn't quite get there with quartile 2, But we have good representation from quartile 1, so the really high impact folks, and then the lower quartile, quartile 4, where folks are not doing as much high impact practice. Good distribution across gender, most of them from our College of Arts and Sciences, a couple of really fun interviews from folks in communication, all for social science or STEM gen education courses again. So is that the kind of information you were hoping for?
Well, I've been evaluated as a teacher in multiple ways at multiple institutions, and I have found that the qualitative evaluations are often more helpful than the quantitative components, but I understand the value of the quantitative for comparing across multiple people, across departments, and so on and so forth. And so I was just curious in terms of practice protocol, because the student evaluation part of this is interesting to me, but how we use this within a department to evaluate peers, to evaluate that aspect of, because I think sort of what you said resonates with me. These things aren't going to be valued here.
Yeah.
Okay, they're just not in our current structure. And so if we want to have them valued, then we're going to have some way in order to actually measure them. But I find the quantitative to be useful to some extent in doing that. But when you're actually helping the faculty member become a stronger teacher, then I would think the qualitative component, if that's developed fully enough, would be the more beneficial element to be used within the department to help particularly young instructors develop over time. To develop those networks. I mean, we've got our director of Learning Center here, and they do a good job of pulling people together across disciplines, across departments, across colleges, things like that. But so that was the reason why I asked about the qualitative component, because I was as much curious about the way in which this would be used within the department as it would be used by the institution, and to gather data from students, which we've already talked about all of the problems with gathering data from students. Here. So that was my curiosity.
Yeah, so our group isn't quite like working on qualitative evaluations of teaching, but I think there are resources on our campus where one gets paired with an expert. They visit the classroom mid-semester and again at the end, and do more of that sort of one-on-one mentoring, talking about actual practices. I really find that valuable. I mean, in an ideal world, our teaching is evaluated by actual practices in our classroom quantitatively through that one-on-one mentoring experience, through classroom visits, through a portfolio experience perhaps, such that all of those things really become a well-rounded picture of our teaching. But I don't know how to answer it from the sort of next steps we're taking in terms of qualitative.
Yeah, so this project we had roughly 3 qualitative components. We had the interviews on barriers, concerns, and obstacles. That was about 13 interviews. Then we had, I believe, another 12 is the number in my head. I can find out the exact number.
There's not a qualitative component to the survey that the students fill out?
No.
I think what he's getting at, because this is a conversation that every time we talk about student evaluations at UTC, it comes back to the same issue.
Yep.
So there's a percentage of the faculty that want to continue to have the open-ended, say whatever you want to say about the professor.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a group of faculty that have consistently pointed out that's where the most biased and abusive comments come.
Yep.
Okay, so I understand what you're asking now. There is a qualitative component on the student version. There is just a place for general comments. And again, the instrument itself is, each item is individually validated. So adding in a qualitative piece doesn't actually invalidate the instrument. And then the other thing is kind of the discussions that are going on campus. The first thing I want to be very clear about is if the only way that you are measuring what is happening in the classrooms on your campus is the S impact, you're doing it wrong. We don't propose that. We're not going to do that on our campus. If we tried to do that on our campus, our faculty senate would revolt, and about 3/4 of the faculty would revolt. It's not the best way of going about it, because student affect matters. The students need a voice, right? They do need a voice, but we need to do it in a way that gets a larger picture. And this is where we're coming together on the Faculty Senate, is thinking about our teaching inputs and our teaching outputs. We need to be looking at a host of things, not just what's going on in the classroom. That's A. We want to know what's going on in the classroom. What can instructors do, right? You know, from my standpoint as a department chair, right, I really want to incentivize instructors doing certain things. I want to build merit around their actions, the things that they can control, right? But I also need to know more about student learning, student knowledge, student engagement, student affect, right? And how that instruction is being, you know, what affect that's having on a student. For example, I can have a professor that is using all kinds of high impact practices, you know, group work, all of that, but oftentimes tells the students that they're, you know, they're dumb and they should know more, and, you know, or whatever. I'm making up, this is not real instructor, I'm just making one up, but this is a hypothetical, right? I want to know that, right? That's going to matter, because that affect's going to matter. It ultimately will have an effect on their learning too, right? And that's one of the places where we see nobody publishes failed projects, right? And so I've witnessed, one good example is I've witnessed the implementation of what's called physics by inquiry. Physics by inquiry was developed by a physics education research group at the University of Washington. It's highly interactive. There are no lectures, right? It's just lab all day long forever. Amen. They come in, they play with toys pretty much the entire time. It is fun. I love it. I have a great time implementing that curriculum. Right? I have watched it fail spectacularly, right? Because it gets implemented very poorly. And if the student doesn't feel that the instructor is there to help them, to guide them, to get them unstuck when they're stuck, right? It doesn't matter how much research it goes into that innovation, right? It's that implementation that matters. And so they might have scored really high in teaching inputs, right? If they sat down and they filled this out. But their outputs would have been horrible. And it would have been because of other things. And there are things that they probably could have changed to help affect that implementation.
I think that's one of the challenges with teaching this online as well.
Yep.
I mean, it's a lot easier to motivate a student sitting in front of you to do something
Yeah.
than it is to motivate a student who's online. And a lot of the teaching outputs, I mean, I'm running an online class right now and check most of the boxes. But whether or not the teaching outputs are matching up to what it is I'm designing on the front end is a very different question. It's largely an asynchronous class. You know, and I would look at it, and I've got a sort of bimodal output within the course. I've got students who can really grab on to what the course is designed to do and are making great progress. And I've got students who either are crunched for time, can't do the research necessary, or don't, for whatever reason, and so you end up with a division in that scenario. The course, I think the design is solid. The outputs, I'm not so sure are. And so finding that space between there is, you know, is going to be a bigger challenge.
Yep. And that's where you, like we were talking about, that qualitative piece, and then that person-to-person professional development can really be helpful, right? Because trying to, you know, here's something that I built that's really good. I control that, and it works out really well, right? But then there's this modality that I don't have any control over that might cause issues, right? And can we translate between those two things, right? Can we sit down and figure out maybe what's not in the one side that might help on the other side,
right,
or whatever? And the answer might just be no one knows. You know, we're still trying to figure that out.
And there's a lot of uncontrollable variables.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
You know, it can be anything from students who have 2 jobs to the fact that you end up with some students who came from elite private school backgrounds and other students who came from underserved public school systems.
Yeah.
And so you're dealing with very different entry levels.
And teaching outputs are linked to teaching inputs, but they are not directly determined by teaching inputs.
Can I just go back and just quickly address what you said? My hope, right, is that you can look at student impact and faculty impact and figure out how you get them to meet, right? My hope is that as more students take faculty impact, that being asked to think not about whether the instructor was enthusiastic or whether they were well organized, whether they did certain things, prompts them to respond to things that are relevant in evaluations at the end of the semester. I don't know if that's true, but that qualitative component, I hope, is more productive with that sort of lead up to it.
We don't have the data yet to say.
I'm curious about the S impact, because one of the comments that people always make is, well, you know, the student showed up 3 times in an entire semester. And so are you collecting any of that information, like interactive from the student's perspective? Was I there a lot, or?
Nope.
Nope.
No, we're not.
Okay.
Again, students lie.
So do faculty.
And so do faculty. Right, but no, we're not, again, it's laser focused on instructional practices. Absolutely laser focused on that. It's in the name. And so we're really only, the big question is, and we're still, you know, the jury is still a little out on this one. Are students capable of being able to observe and then category and, you know, inventory the practices that a faculty member is doing in their class? Are they able to actually translate that? We think so far with the limited data we have that that is the case, but we don't have any good correlations between what faculty say they're doing and what students say they're doing, right? And so that's where we still need to make that correlations. We've got pretty good correlations between what faculty say they're doing and what a trained observer sees them doing. And so the question becomes, can the student outdo that? So at a minimum, you have a faculty inventory, and it's pretty good. It's subject to all of the self-report issues that you're going to find, you know, on any kind of instrument that's a self-report instrument, especially when you put it into the personnel decision-making process and RPT process. You all of a sudden go, oh, what do I need to get a high score? Click, 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 right? Right, that can happen. We don't see it happening in our surveys and in our studies because there's no risks associated, right? This is low stakes for them participating in our research process, right? But you can imagine that being the case. That's why we're really looking at the student version and making sure that will translate well. And if it does, well, that'll be pretty exciting. And still not get all of those pieces yet, and we're never going to do that.
No, you're always going to have people who
Yeah.
show up just for the exams.
There's always going to be people who show
Yep.
up.
They have no idea what you
Yep.
did in class.
Yep.
Yep.
You know, I teach physics. 10% of the students can. The 10% of students that fail, almost always fail because they never came. But there's nothing. I mean, we have all the different. You know, we can implement all the different early warning systems and all of that, but you're going to have a decent percentage that are not going to put in the work. And sometimes it's for very, very, very good reasons, medical reasons. It's for, you know, family reasons, access reasons. There's a whole host of reasons. But you know, again, that's not a controllable variable by an instructor. Right?
Except to the extent that they can increase interactions
That's
between
right.
students and students or faculty and students. And the impact at least gives you some actionable things you can do that might.
That's true, and there's
Yeah.
there's a lot of cases where students don't show up because they don't find value in showing up. They show up for the exams. So if you're just grading exams, if that's the primary way in which you are distributing your grade, right? And the student and the student doesn't find value in, say, a lecture or whatever that's happening in the classroom, they don't show up. And then they show up. I know this from personal anecdote, and I'm always embarrassed to tell it, but I always tell it anyway because I'm an idiot. But I failed a biology class. I saw Jennifer left, so this is good. I failed a biology class when I was in college, right? Because I went to the class. It was insanely boring. The only thing they graded was the exams. I went to the first exam. I got an A just by reading the book before going in, and then forgot I was in the class. Until I got my grades and I had an F in the class because I didn't show up for any of the other exams. Right? That was me. That's a case study right there. I learned from that. I grew maybe, not really. I'm still a bit of an idiot, but these are, you know, kinds of examples where if I found some value in that class. So can we speak to the student and show value in what they're getting? And when they find value. Now that also happens in the highly interactive space. And so in my work in physics education research, where we've done a lot of work on innovative pedagogy in physics, as you sit down and work with students, especially high achieving students, you have to be very careful in the way that you grade. So one of the areas that we were really interested in is scientific practices, and really incorporating scientific practice and reasoning within
the structure of our course, and that being the prize, right? The thing that we primarily were looking at. And it's really hard to make movements in scientific reasoning ability. Really difficult. I have entire presentations over an hour about this, and I have 2 books that I've written on this topic, right? And it's still very difficult. One of the things we found is you have to be very careful about how you assess your student, because your assessment is showing to the student what you value. And really good students interpret that exactly as it is. That my exam has all this like content stuff that you're measuring, but in class you're having me do all of this like reasoning, metacognition stuff, and practice stuff, right? And so we were finding a lot of feedback from students when we first started on that one particular project. This stuff is fun. I like doing all the labs, but I don't see where it's really helping me learn what I need to learn, and I'm not learning the content. Well, they are, and we had the data to prove that, but they didn't feel like it. And so what we did was just change the evaluation. We changed the assessment. The assessment was changed to focus. First off, we looked at our assessments. Went, oh, we were looking at about 85% content knowledge and about 15% or so on reasoning and practice, and then we were divorcing them from each other. And so then we built assessments that were more three-dimensional that incorporated those pieces together. And all of a sudden, those comments kind of went away, because the student, what they were doing in class was being reflective of how they were being measured. So little things like that. That goes to the questions that you were having up there, that qualitative piece of having that disciplinary expertise, right? It's really hard for even a chemistry professor to come into a physics class, right, and see what's going on in that classroom to make those sorts of changes. And so that's always a challenge when you're measuring. It's why you cannot measure student learning as an institution, right? As much as I would love to give Lauren a metric for student learning on campus in different departments and in different courses, we can't, right? And you can't at least a metric that's comparable. Right, I have things that I can use in some of my courses. Julie has things she can use in some of her sociology courses, right? But if you took her learning gains in sociology and compared them to my learning gains in physics, it would make no sense, right? They were just completely different instruments, completely different analyses because of the nature of the class. So again, that's why we kind of focused on. So first of all, a student can't evaluate it. They can't evaluate how much learning they've achieved. We know that. Right, that's just not possible. But can they evaluate what happened in the classroom? And that's the framing that we take. What's going on in the class? What are the practices being used?
I don't know how much conversations on your campus are tied to tying evaluations to student learning and assessment. On our campus, sort of assessment comes from the ground up and gets reported up the chain, so that on our campus, evaluations of teaching are not evaluations of learning. And assessment really is up to the instructor to determine whatever thing they want to use to evaluate whether students are learning something. And it can't be a grade on a test or a final grade, right?
No well-designed test.
Nope.
Any other questions? Comments? Thank you all.
Thank you.